Hello, hello. Welcome. Everyone found a seat? There's one down here if anyone's interested. My name is Anne Stoller. I'm the director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. But before we begin this evening, I wanted to say something. We've had our first day of the Institute this morning, and it's not only been an extraordinary experience, but one thing that's been very clear, speaking about Hegel and Marx and Freud, is that there's a lot of synergy between them. And the fellows have asked that on Thursday, and this is only for the fellows, I apologize, but I do need to make the announcement, we are going to add a session in about Orlando. And it will be in the afternoon, after a short lunch, 12:30 to 1:30, and at 1:30 we'll have that session. You'll still have all of Thursday afternoon, evening to yourselves, but we thought, given the spirit of the Institute, that this is about work here and now and how it matters. Speaking about Orlando and confronting those issues is really important. So welcome then to the first public lecture as part of this year's Summer Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. How does one introduce Gayatri Spivak? They just say Spivak. Certainly not by listing all of her accomplishments. Certainly not by reverting to the truism that she needs no introduction, which we always hear over and again. What if we start from another vantage point and assume instead that she does, that is, need an introduction? What might it look like if we followed her trajectory, not starting with the heights from which we more commonly know her as the, or Homie might disagree, or Edward might have, but as the post-colonial theorist, or at least part of the tripart, and global intellectual, but as someone who has worked hard for over a half a century in a long trajectory to accomplish what she has. I take this perspective as a tribute to her, as a reminder that intellectual and political work is arduous labor. And she did not arrive where she is without it. As she put it in one of the numerous interviews, she was born in Calcutta to a solidly metropolitan, middle-class family, belonging to, I quote, and this is important for understanding her trajectory, the first generation of Indian intellectuals after independence, unquote, who did graduate work at Cornell in the early 1960s, because, as she said, Cornell was one of the only names that she knew, along with Harvard. I think there was one more, Princeton.
Yay!
Yale!
Not Princeton.
Not Princeton. And more importantly, and you will all really take to this, because it was the only department that offered her money.
No, I borrowed money.
Oh, she
I
borrowed.
borrowed money on a life mortgage.
Well, you fell into comparative literature because it was the one that offered you money. That's what they say.
Demand. You see, I had no work permit. I was going to be deported. I had no visa. And the English department would not give me financial aid because my native language was not English. Demand had one fellowship that he hadn't filled, soft money, and he thought that if he gave it to me and I proved, he could argue it away as cultural difference. So I went into corporate. That's the story, kid.
Like for many of us. That's the story. So, this is how we wanted to begin. This is great. Absolutely dialogic to the core, right? Like for many of us, her first job was not where she would end, nor necessarily where she might have liked to have been. She received her MA in English from Cornell, and while teaching at the University of Iowa, wrote her dissertation on Yeats under the direction of Paul Dumas. She ordered Derrida's De la grammatologie out of a catalog in 1967 and produced a preface to that work that has been acclaimed as, I quote, setting a new standard. I don't know if this was a compliment or not, for self-reflexivity
Was it Terry?
in prefaces. It wasn't from Terry. No, but that quote wasn't from Terry. 50 years later, as only Gayatri Spivak might do, she's retranslated that work for us. But before Spivak became Spivak, who is now and has been a distinguished university professor at Columbia since 2007, she taught far and wide, from Iowa to Pittsburgh to Penn, and eventually to Columbia, where she continues to speak forcefully about those issues that those ensconced in the privileged sites of knowledge production, like Columbia, prefer not to hear. Where she continues to demand an unlearning of what we think we know. Her work, as we know, presses on the academy as it reaches outside of it to teach every year in rural schools in India. Work, I would hazard, that is as important to her as any of the numerous books for which she is so well known, as well as her activism. Her work, as she herself puts it, is interventionist, and one might add to the core. Whether it is an eminent critique of subaltern studies or post-colonial studies or feminist theory, in its ever-present Eurocentric mode. And in her breath, she addresses feminists, philosophers, critics, and activists as they converge and diverge in making sense of the distribution of profits and privations of the global political economy. I can do no better for us than quote Gayatri herself on Marx, her subject for us this evening, as she wrote, "Marx could hold the science of logic and the blue books together, but that was still only Europe, and in the doing it came undone," unquote. It's an acute insight for us about pedagogy and concepts formation and politics, that they're based on grounded, detailed, empirical work. There are no shortcuts. And they must also ground our conceptual and political labor. As Venkat Mani at Stanford put it, as we try to learn about the history of the vanishing present from this global feminist Marxist scholar, it would be safe to say Gayatri Spivak can hold the Bhagavad Gita and UNESCO's Encyclopedia of Life Support Systems together. But I would argue that she does more. She rips at the seams of conventional scholarship and makes demands on her readers that are part of her project, is something that Judith has written about in defense of Gayatri's writing. In undoing the discrete sites of knowledge production, both what we think we know and how we know it. It's an honor and a pleasure to have her among us as one of the masters, another term that all three of our masters absolutely refused, in this year's Summer Institute, providing us with a way to ask, and not just rhetorically, as she said last night, why Marx today? Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction. I have no way that I could possibly match, and if you, there are actually seats here and there. I could actually match what you have just described, but no, that's the genre of the introduction, isn't it? And Gayatri Spivak is the next best thing to Aristotle, so why not? So we will just go with that. We literally types know these genres, okay? So don't pay, and no, actually, believe every word. That's the only way to go. Isn't that what we to do with the literary? Well, listen, this talk really has global Marx question mark, right? This talk has really kind of gotten away from me in many ways. I began it, in fact, it has been published in Spanish. I began it for the Universidad de San Martín in Buenos Aires. And then it's because since 1978, my teaching of Marx and my acute awareness that the text was written in German was necessarily short on secondary scholarship, but interactive, attempting to move with a diversified and changing world, it just kind of got away from me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read as much of it as I have revised, and then I'm going to read a text called The Vanishing Present, which you mentioned it, which also relates to this question, global Marx question mark. You know, the first question, of course, that one asks is, what is global? And we have a sense of what is global and what is planetary. I would like to quote something from a piece published by Bruno Latour in Millennium very recently, where he decides that Europe, quote unquote, imperial Europe if you like, needs to recall the global because it is something that Europe seduced all its imperial possessions with. And I would also like to say that this relates to a way in which Europe wants to claim continentality. You know, it's the outer edge of our great continent, the island of Eurasia. And imperial Europe is even a smaller part of that outer edge. But it won, and it's, you know, you should hear me talking to my rural schools about why they won. And I'm not, you would think of me as very Eurocentric as I talk to them about Europe winning, but that's not something that I can talk to you about now because it's not an implied audience. But at any rate, the idea of continentality, claiming continentality, but also claiming mastership of interpellation. You know, like Europe says, hey you, and you say, yes, that's me, that's me. So this particular thing is reflected once again in Latour's really quite brilliant essay recently published, as I say, in Millennium. And what we would like to say is that that notion that they have to recall Europe has to recall the globe, and he makes it very clear that by recall he means recall like bad models of cars, because they actually took us in, all of us, Imperial Europe took us in by recalling, and that's really not something that that interpellation most of us now refuse. I'll quote Latour, well, it is this exotic vision of nature that Europe, and then more generally the West, has sold to the rest of the world as the real, earthly, natural, material world, and all the other collectives, those who had many other ways of assembling entities, were rendered archaic, exotic, pre-modern, and irrational by comparison. Am I really wrong in thinking that this is the globe, that it is the responsibility of Europe to recall? The answer is yes. Yes, you should realize that it's not something that we are worrying about, that your globe is not our globe. And I'll say something about something that you do, I hope some of you have read, the way in which some years ago I thought about planetarity, where really Europe recalling the globe was not an issue. The planet was going to go extinct anyway, whatever we did. So to an extent, there is a kind of limit to this, where the small claim of Europe is not what we want to think about. Again, quote, recalling in the sense that we recall a memory and trace it back through history and the philosophy of science to see
how it is that such a perverse and improbable procedure has been generated and expanded everywhere, how the res extensa has been literally extended, but, quote, recalling also in the business sense of bringing back a badly designed product so it is debugged and refitted. So that we don't want this refitted globe. All people of the world have bought from us, the Europeans, a product that was supposed to give them access to the secular material world, and so on. It's quite a brilliant essay, but I think there is a problem here, and he's talking about the globe and the world. If you will allow me to quote from this piece called Planetarity, which is published and which I hope some of you have read, what I was saying there, if we think planet thought in this mode of alterity, is the last paragraph, the thinking opens up to embrace an inexhaustible taxonomy of such names, including, but not identical with, the whole range of human universals. Aboriginal animism, as well as the spectral white mythology of post-rational science. If we imagine ourselves as planetary subjects rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities, alterity remains underived from us. It is not our dialectical negation. It contains us as much as it flings us away. And thus to think of it is already to transgress, for in spite of our forays into what we render through metaphor differently as outer and inner space, it remains that what is above and beyond our own reach is not continuous with us, as it is not indeed specifically discontinuous. We must persistently educate ourselves into the peculiar mindset of accepting the untranslatable, even as we are programmed to transgress that mindset by, quote, translating it into the mode of, quote, acceptance. This is a humbler project, but it at least acknowledges that this goes from, if we think of the planet in that way, rather than simply as a naturalized space where we are conserving resources and so on, we go from a taxonomy that can begin, and perhaps there is a beginning before that, with animisms, and go all the way. So this, I think, to an extent, I would offer this to Latour, who's a very smart man, a wonderful guy. In fact, I like his work. But this idea that Europe has to recall it now for us in order for them to refit it so that we can all have it again. I think this goes with that desire for continentality and the mastership of interpellation, which is something that we refuse. I will not say, like the feminist partners in Goldman Sachs after the subprime, they were not feminist, sorry, female. Bad error. They were brought out to somehow claim that all was well, right? I will not, or we, I hope, will not accept that interpolation to say that all is well. Thank you. We will get the refitted global so we can have access to the secular. So now my argument circles around Antonio Gramsci's well-known remark in his prison notebook number 10. I quote, "The proposition contained in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy to the effect that human beings acquire consciousness of structural conflicts on the level of ideologies should be considered as an affirmation of gnosiological and not simply psychological and moral value. From this, it follows that the theoretical practical principle of hegemony has also gnosiological significance. The realization of a hegemonic apparatus, insofar as it creates a new ideological terrain, determines a reform of consciousness and of methods of knowledge. When one succeeds in introducing a new morality in conformity with a new conception of the world, one finishes by introducing the conception as well. In other words, one determines a reform of the whole of philosophy." Now, this particular idea of the gnosiological in Marx's project, I suggest that it was between this and the epistemological that our project of can there be a global Marx today hangs. gnosiological, gnosis, diagnosis, and so on and so forth, and epistemological, which is somewhat different. Now, what I want to say is that as this piece came somewhat undone, it's going to be finished. I mean, it's not don't be alarmed. I mean, I have to give it in. It's actually for the volume for my wonderful friends. One of them is dead, Stephen Resnick and Rick Wolf, and they were the ones who actually welcomed me into economics quite a few years ago, 1975, by saying that my scattered speculation on the question of value was interesting to economists. I was blown away. So I really owe them a debt of gratitude, and so I will absolutely finish this one. But because I take them so seriously, I think it's also coming somewhat undone. And one of the questions that I asked also, what is global? Fine. But I also asked, what is Marx's project? I mean, who is the agent of this global Marx business? As far as I understand, Marx's project is to turn capital from capitalist to socialist uses, again and again and again and again. This is Marx's project, not revolution, that's not his thing. The real basic thing, one of the problems that people find it hard to understand is that it's not capital that Marx is criticizing. Marx is criticizing the capitalist use of capital. Now, one of the ways in which Marx, this is Marx 101, forgive me for repeating this, but on the other hand, in order to make my own problems clear, I have to say it. One of the ways in which this is going to be done is through the homeopathy of the quantification of labor. I've said this in print many a time, and it's not something that is complicated, but there it is. I have to repeat it at this point. The homeopathy of the quantification of labor, the abstract average, that is Arbeitskraft, that's labor power. It's value without a content, right? And so if the worker owns the means of production, they can use this in order to produce surplus value, keep as much as is necessary to go on, continue, and use the rest for social justice. But why should they want to do that? See, that's the real question. Have we had any proof in this unexamined humanism that if they had the means of production in their hands, and if they did indeed understand that quantification of labor rather than arithmetical addition of private labor, that this was a weapon, that this was labor power which when consumed produced more value, and therefore you could use that rather than rob it as the capitalist would. You could use part of it to keep yourself alive, and then you could use the rest to build social justice. Why should this be? What has proved to us that this would happen? Nothing. So to an extent, that's the real problem. And so in other words, the epistemological project here is a project, as I say, and you must understand in what spirit I'm saying it, okay? The epistemological project is to dehumanize, because the human, Anthropocene doesn't just belong. The other day, the access to being human is in fact the beginning. I've described it as the structure of rape. That's why there are so many mythological stories, I think, of the access to human beginning in rape. The idea of being impregnated through the ears and this and that, or of course also without a woman, without a vagina, not out of a vagina, not just Athena, also our own Sita, Ionija, that's what not born of a yoni, that's, born out of a furrow. The furrow girl whose name was Sita, Sita meaning furrow girl, and whose dad, and she didn't, the Mahabharata says, the Ramayana says that she was a yonija, not born out of a yoni, not born out of a vagina. And so this is kind of female transcendental. And her dad's name was, what was her father's name? Father. So there are Janaka, that means simply father. So in this kind of a classic way, what happens is, in the end, the female transcendental vanishes again into the earth. So to an extent, this whole notion of not being able to describe the access to the human except through peculiar structures of procreation, as it were. You remember the beginning of the Oedipus, where Sophocles talks about seeds being thrown. That's where it begins, right? That's how. And Freud misread this because he thought that Sophocles was simply repeating the myth, whereas Sophocles, as a single writer, was in fact questioning the myth, which is a very complicated thing. But at any rate, so therefore, the idea is to take the human as it happens, which wants really to protect itself, to preserve itself, to destroy everything else, and so on, and imagine, so this unquestioned implicit humanism in the conviction that if the working class agent learned that he or she was the agent of production rather than a victim of capitalism, that they would unquestioningly build for social justice. Nothing supports this. And so today, when the agent of turning capital away from capitalist to socialist uses has become, the subject of the agent has become the citizen rather than the worker, because of the place of labor within our global picture, it has become even more doubtful. So therefore, I asked not just what is global, but who is going to do this good thing? And so in Gramsci's epistemological confidence, finally, also is something that one has to question. And to an extent, what I will do, I really didn't notice when I began. So, let me see. Okay. I will try to stop at 50 minutes. What I will do at the end is come back to this question as to how can we say that there will be agents in this incredibly diversified world. If we're not going to make jokes about, I hear about Marxism, and the people who are sitting there, it's as if they're going to save the world. What? You're going to save the world? I remember I went to a Lacanian Congress, and they were going to save the world. And what? They didn't have a creche. Why? Because the city didn't allow a creche. And I said, you couldn't even get a creche because the city didn't allow it, and you're going to save the world. What are you talking about? So to an extent, I don't have that problem, that kind of idea that I'm going to make a difference, I'm going to change the world, and so on. No. I'm just only a teacher of the literary, but I can ask questions and I can state a problem. And that's what I'm doing, and in the end, I will come back to it. So now, let me read a little bit from The Vanishing Present. And you know the questions that I have. What is global, and who is going to do this moving capital again and again from capitalist to socialist users? This, by the way, travels. This travels. I know there are people in this audience who understand Bengali, and that's my village schools, right? To them too, I do say, Punji bhalo, capital is good. Punji bhalo, Pujibad kharab, capitalism is bad. So to an extent, that whole notion of using capital for socialist uses or social uses is something that I'll keep hanging. Who is going to do it? Okay, now comes The Vanishing Present. In 1999, I published a book called A Critique of Postcolonial Reason with the subtitle called The History of the Vanishing Present. Its original title was Don't Call Me Postcolonial, which was changed at Amartya Sen's suggestion. It was a put-together book because all I had was my suspicion of the scapegoating of colonialism, taking my own position as a member of the critical Indian nationalist bourgeoisie, a vulgar Fanonian position that I can now diagnose, running all the gnoseological risks, and taking my specific perspective as globally valid, a general failing shared by most of us. I had a sense of a vanishing present theoretically by Derrida's statement that difference spelled with an A was a footnote on Hegel's description of the present as eine differente Beziehung, a differencing relationship, and Benjamin's now time, the past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant of its recognizability, never to be seen again. History is the object of a construction whose site forms not with homogeneous empty time, but time filled with the now time. Now, today I know that in Europe, urban resistance among the previously colonized appropriately uses the words post-colonial, decolonial, etc. Here too, the phenomenon of class claims, which I criticized in 1999, do of course operate, as does help from the good members of the former colonizers about our alliances with whom Fanon also had some bitter predictive comments, that the nationalist bourgeoisie, after independence, is going to find their friends in the good whites, rather than the class differentiated folks who really put themselves in the line of fire. And that is in fact universally true, and Guy died young, but some of the predictions he made are amazing. As an activist intellectual, I support European post-colonial urban resistance wholeheartedly. Yet here too, that tendency to take a specific perspective as globally valid is at work. It should be allowed to flourish in the field of struggle as a weapon. Yet at the same time, when intellectuals offer general theories, plus or minus, based on the paleonymy of these words, post-colonial, decolonial, I must connect it to another history. And in order to connect it to another history, I'm going to read something, and I hope my seminar will forgive me because I read it there, saying that I will read it this evening. I want to read to you the 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto. The 1872 preface, okay, this is not an esoteric archival finding that you suddenly research and say, oh, they do have some archival stuff on the Communist Manifesto, isn't that exciting? No, it's right there. So, in that manifesto, in that introduction, they say, because they saw the ways in which revolutions failed in 1848 and 1871, I quote, no special stress is to be laid on the revolutionary guidelines, their word is Maßregeln, revolutionary guidelines proposed at the end of section 2. Preface, pay no attention to the stuff that we say about revolution in the Communist Manifesto. Also because of, I quote, the immense and continuous development of big industry, their words are die immense Fortentwicklung der großen Industrie. Großen, this thing is not in the translation. Big industry. In the last 25 years, they continue, and the failed revolutions, of course, they say, today this program has in some details become outdated, veraltet, whatever we suggest about revolutions in the Communist Manifesto. One thing especially, they go on, was proved by the Paris Commune of 1871, just the year before, namely that, and I quote, they have another quotation, the working class cannot simply occupy in Besitz-nehmen, which is very nice, of course, it's the word that is in Freud translated as Affekt. So the working class cannot simply occupy with desire, right? As in catharsis. The working class cannot simply occupy Wall Street. No, of course they didn't like that. They were close. The working class cannot simply occupy the ready-made state machine. And they say Staatsmaschinen, which is generally translated as machinery of the state, which is not the same thing. We should know, Indian Union, we inherited the British state machine, and look what's happened. We are at the point of losing the democratic impulse even as I speak. It began democratic with Orientalist visions of what India was, a certain class which turned dynastic, and then now we are losing it. Because you cannot, as they say in that 1872 preface, you cannot simply occupy the ready-made state machine and set it in motion for its own purposes. Then they comment on the changes in the political situation, and thus they warn that communism will relate to today's world differently. In other words, no Gespenst geht Okay, this is their comment in their final preface to the Communist Manifesto. Who pays any attention to this? We must take the next to the last sentence seriously. The manifesto has, they write, become a historical document that we cannot give ourselves the right any longer to alter. It's a museum piece. We can't alter it. Read it in that spirit, they say. In other words, keep up with the times, learn the lesson of history, make your own revolution. And so it is in terms of that we have to really connect to another history. And we have to revise the idea of whatever history it is that we are thinking of in terms of the fact that the globe is not small. It's highly diversified, and it is certainly Europe had an important part to play in its history, but it does not play the role of recalling the global in order to refit it for us again. No. So therefore, the idea that we must connect it to another history. This particular tendency, theorizing tendency, to see one's chosen group of beneficiaries as globally valid begins to be displaced into the dominant, as Raymond Williams knew, as, quote, idea of knowledge as knowledge about knowledge. And in fact, if we don't pay attention to this, brilliant projects like David Harvey's distant learning summary of Marx's writing becomes complicit with the technological will to power through knowledge. What is it to, quote, know what Marx wrote? Such an idea preserves the old academic conviction that this kind of idea of knowledge is knowledge about knowledge, and it halts thesis 11. It halts thesis 11. I'm suggesting that thesis 11 doesn't have an agent anymore. It's a desire written in Marx's text. And of course, those are early, and as you know, Engels rewrote it in various ways. But nonetheless, it's a desire. But this way of summarizing Marx through technological means, I'm not a technophobe, but there are certain kinds of things that you teach differently. And it's like, as I have said before, to put a very crude analogy, it's like exercise. You can't do it through distant learning. You have to actually, if you're following that, you have to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So it's kind of slow cooking the soul, as it were, in order to be able to use the extraordinary resources of the digital. That's what I'm talking about. You can't do it the other way. Such work must therefore be forever supplemented by the double bind of one-on-one teaching, possibly producing collectivities. Thesis 3. I understand the supplement to be dangerous because it suggests that what is offered as a totality is incomplete and introduces the incalculable, since all must forever look beyond to an undisclosable future of use. My own work is so openly supplemental that I need fear no ancestor worship. It's of course also true that I'm not leaving behind widows to worship me for the rest of their lives. But it's an interesting thought. When Rosa Luxemburg died, Clara Zetkin wrote an extraordinary eulogy, and Louis Zagowski also wrote an eulogy. But because Luxemburg had in fact disagreed with Kautsky in terms of his liberalizing tendencies, at the end Louis Zagowski was obliged to write some critical words about how Luxemburg didn't know how to, I forget now what exactly she wrote. But Zetkin came back and said pretty much, there you're not writing as a woman, but as a wife. And I'm very glad that I will leave behind no wives to worship me forever, and I hate disciples, I don't have disciples, but I discourage them with such rudeness that I know that nobody will worship me in that boring way when my days on this earth are gone. You will see that it is in that spirit that I have asked the question of global Marxism. You know, I mean, people will come say, Mrs. Spivak, I'm a real friend of yours. So I will say, do you know what that word is short for? And most people don't know. It's fanatic. I do not want fanatic supporters. And what have you read? Anything but Can the Subaltern Speak? Goodbye, I say. They don't love me for this. Anyway, so my own works, etc. Attempting then to move with a diverse and changing world and acknowledging Marx's own acknowledgement of the limit of his thinking in the difference between the many drafts for and the actual reply to Vera's Asulich, I attempted to situate Marx's urbanist teleology as others have. And then I'm going to read a little bit from this other thing and go back to Vanishing Present. I was just returning from the World Economic Forum when I was writing these passages. You may well ask me, why do I associate myself with the World Economic Forum? And I will tell you why. Because of I do field work there. Because, you know, like, we can really change the world, we can really do everything. These characters, in fact, can affect policy. And yet, they really need a reality check. So therefore, I associate with them for the same reason that I associate with the largest sections of the sectors of the electorate in Africa and Asia. The landless, illiterate folks, etc., the so-called subalterns. Because unless you get a sense of who can actually access policy, all this talk about how you're really changing the world because you're a real Marxist is nonsense, number one. Sitting at a university, number one. Number two, also, the idea I associate with R&D, because they too can, in fact, affect policy, and they do. And the R&D scene is a horrifying scene. And I will come back to that in a moment. But let me talk about this, what was happening in Rwanda. The World Economic Forum on Africa, almost the last session, I attended many sessions. I was suffering from pneumonia, but nonetheless I thought, what is pneumonia? Just a disease. And I'm sorry, don't let me dramatize myself. Why not? You know, at my age, it's the only thing left. Other people are not going to dramatize me anymore. Alas, those days are gone. But of all the sessions I attended, the last one was run in a brisk British way. John Legend spoke of the fact that roads and railways will not be constructed in Africa in the foreseeable future. Now remember, Africans themselves, upper class Africans, fat cats, who absolutely ignore the infrastructure, they were also participating in this with full willingness, okay? So therefore the question, who is going to turn capital into socialist uses? And these folks, I'm part of a committee on social exclusion, economic growth and social exclusion. They don't really know that this promise within capitalist globalization that there's nothing but social productivity has to ignore that it also requires constant subalternization. They don't know, they can't know unless, and if you say this, they're not necessarily there to listen, but I will say more about this. Let's talk about this Rwanda thing. Roads and railways will not be constructed in Africa in the foreseeable future, and the skies were underused, said Mr. Legend, who is apparently also a novelist. He's a British man. A previous session was devoted to liberalizing air travel. Therefore, said Mr. Legend, transportation should take place in drone ports, which would house robots. Apparently, one was already under contract for such a thing, or perhaps I misunderstood, and it was already open in Rwanda. The entire discourse at the World Economic Forum reminds one of Marx's remarks in the Trinity formula, that those who promote the unlimited social productivity of capital alone can fortunately, glücklich, says Marx, fortunately forget surplus value. Rick Wolff, in fact, one of the people to whom this piece will finally be dedicated, has taught us how to go back and back and back and back along the chain of these promises and once again arrive at the fact of the theft of surplus value, which allows capitalism to flourish. This, apart from the fact that today to take for granted that roads and railways were not to be built on the ground, soon resembles somewhat the removal of possibility thinking from the rural some decades ago with the advent of oil. Primary production went to hell. In fact, starch surpluses began to be brought in from the United States with subsidies. And although there is some effort now on the part of Nigerians to redo this kind of devastation, with people like Dangote, this is already from the inside by rich Africans. It's being undermined. So to an extent, this story of who is going to use capital for socialist rather than capitalist uses is a real question when you look at the actual people, not just generalizing the class, etc. I'm naming names of people I know and speak to because I do field work like an ethnologist. This is my field work, the World Economic Forum, being inside there, rather because at this stage I don't care what people say, but oh, Spivak goes to the World Economic Forum. You eat well. But the entire discourse, etc. Who will build the drones? Another participant from MIT answered Fab Labs. This is a result of working the digital to assure that you can yourself build anything you want to, changing 2D, 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. I've actually seen this in Anish Kapoor's art, and I wrote about that, saying, comparing it to shit and so on, and he very much liked being an artist that I actually use the word shit and so on, and I think it's in the piece that has now been published by Guggenheim, who knew then that this is actually not just Anish Kapoor being an Indian abroad, but answered Fab Labs. This is a result of working the digital to assure that you can yourself build anything you want to, changing 2 dimension to 3 dimension. In answer to a question about joblessness in Africa today, from the audience, a young African, that because there are people there who come like me to see these people at work. So we asked about joblessness. This guy told us that we should change the idea of how to get things, that getting a job and making money in order to get things was not the only way. You could make what you wanted. I quote, launching a new Fab Lab requires assembling enough of the hardware and software inventory to be able to share people and projects with other Fab Labs, unquote, says part of the online promo. So this is once again Rick Wolf's lesson of working back to the theft of surplus value. Who is the agent of this kind of access to Fab Labs? The guy is saying to a young African who's asking, what about joblessness? Oh, you must think a new way of making things. You don't need a job to make things. You can just make them in Fab Labs. So you remember the extreme astonishment of folks like James Stewart and Adam Smith at facing the sudden invention of a way of working, which is not to make things for yourself or for a person who wanted you to make a thing for himself or herself. This is something that we forget, that Adam Smith is full of exclamation points. They had never seen anything like this. My God, I mean, what a completely new thing. So they were very, very surprised. So rather in great quantities for selling and making money over and over again. James Stewart gave the name industry to this way of working, and as I was saying to my seminar, there it is. We must have a new word for this new thing, and in the middle of the page, big type, industry. He coins this word to describe this extraordinary new way of dealing with making money and making things. There are pages, particularly the first pages of the Wealth of Nations, full of exclamation points. The great surprise, having to change the idea of making. Now here, within that last framework, was being offered at the tip of technology ways of going back to the other way. You remember all the stuff that we have seen in McLuhan and one kind of Lyotard about Kasinahua, and that it would be exactly like the third world, except all the dirt would be removed. This thing is now being offered again, exactly like it used to be in the pre-capitalist days, except you need a certain degree of the hardware and software inventory to be able to get into this fab lab. Anyway, so the top ways of going back to the other way, except through a denial that that historical framework was still at work and would displace itself with this new bit of digital idealism. There is no room for discussing this here, especially since I myself am unprepared to do so, just having heard these gentlemen and contrasted them to the general level of discourse at the summit. But I place this here as an extreme form of the promise of globalization with which distant learning is complicit. And whenever I say complicit, I mean folded together. I mean folded together, complicit, folded together, not conspiratorial or underhanded or doing these awful things. To acknowledge that we are folded together with what we are critiquing is not something that will give way to what Terry Eagleton suggests in his extraordinarily boring review of the grammatology in whatchamacallit, in the Times Literary Supplement. It is quite clear that he did not take a look at the book at all, and he just came out with his own. Why is he so threatened by post-structuralism? He should, it's like, if I may say something which is completely correct, but perhaps I shouldn't mention it here, but having said it, I will say it. Alain Badiou did not come to the last session of the colloque in Paris. Apparently he wrote, nobody showed me this, so I can only say apparently, a 4-page letter saying that he could not participate in a colloque where I had also been invited. This was truly, this just was last week. He gave me an unbelievably undeserved amount of importance by doing this. I've never written on him. It's what is the problem. So to an extent, it's that kind of problem that Terry Eagleton gives to something he calls post-structuralism by constantly telling us that it was dated to begin with and it's very dated now. So it is. So what's the deal? Move on, Terry. Don't accept these reviews where you're just going to say the same thing over again. But anyway, so there is no room for discussing. But I place this here as an extreme form of the promise of globalization with which distant learning is complicit. Just change the idea of the interaction of learning, its transference, and you can know what Marx really thought while you're in a position to make your computer in a fab lab. So this is the kind of fieldwork that is necessary, and I'll come to the R&D before I finish. I should really finish pretty soon, no? I really didn't look, but I will come to the R&D when I'm ready to finish. In what way I'm involved with it. So, this particular theorizing tendency then to see one's chosen group of beneficiaries as globally valid begins to be displaced into the dominant, as Raymond Williams knew, as idea of knowledge as knowledge about knowledge. The phrase is Derrida's, too general for a citation. The Raymond Williams caution is against the incessant appropriation of the oppositional as alternative by the dominant. And we are all happy to be alternatives. That's how the so-called visible minorities from elite universities in the so-called global south get fellowships. And we get higher allocations because that means we are more global. See, this is the problem. I'm at both ends. I'm at a Research One university, which is talking about how can Columbia be global, and I'm at that other end in the largest sector of the electorate. It's very interesting. I had dinner at the Grimaldi Palace on the 10th night, on the 9th night, okay? And I met Grace Kelly's granddaughter who is into philosophy and literature and so on. I've never seen food like that. Believe me, I've eaten at big foundation fellowship dinners, etc. I have never seen food like that, okay? And dessert, I have never seen dessert like that, okay? The next morning at 8 a.m., I was talking to Dhananjay Lohar and Ujjwal Lohar, two of my supervisors, who eat when the time for starving comes around. They tighten their belts and stop. So to an extent, I was happy to be at the Grimaldi Palace. I love eating and drinking. I mean, I don't drink anymore. But on the other hand, if you are going to feel comfortable with both sides, then, and I am comfortable with both sides, I tell them, I don't think of you as particularly poor, just as I don't think of my students in the United States as particularly rich. Students are students, they're under erasure. They're hardly human, they're students. So therefore, so even though you have, since you know what I think about human beings, this is not necessarily a negative thing to say. You love your students, you love your students. But that's a very different kind of love from what you do in terms of, if you turn them into human beings, you would have trouble. But at any rate, so therefore, this idea of the incessant appropriation of the oppositional as alternative by the dominant, our claims to post-colonial visions and other universals must attend to that caution. Historiography, whether it is macro or micro, privatized as cultural memory or testimony or rationalized as the law of time passing, even symptomatized in a travesty of psychoanalysis, is an attempt to fix the present by ordering the past. And self-conscious activism as justified self-interest, grouped or individual, or as development, was a way of allowing the present to vanish by deciding the future, again by ordering the past. A vulgar conclusion, this is what Bruno Latour was doing, an order, and recall it. We Europeans can recall that global and refit it for you. A vulgar conclusion within which I'm myself trapped, yet from within my own unacknowledged entrapments, I'm obliged to note that in the urban European struggles, the present is being narrativized in terms of a past of being colonized or having been colonized. I sense a complicity here, a being folded togetherness with the other side, letting off the North and the South in Asia and Africa, what I said before, fat cats at the top and no infrastructure. Below, expanding Wendy Brown's localized sense of what is disappearing of a past narrativized as more democratic, and finessing the evidence provided by the new immigration from the new Khilafat narrativizable as the undoing of the Osmanli by way of the Sykes-Picot and assimilating it into the post-colonial discourse. I cannot ignore the intellectual's obligation not to take it as unmediated global evidence. I ask us to go global as globality changes incessantly to the rhythm of electronic capital. Now, I'm skipping some, when I started what I narrativize, I keep using this ugly word so that I don't set myself outside of the social texts I'm reading, as this new phase of my so-called activism over 30 years ago, the person who guided me was Zafrullah Chaudhry in Bangladesh. I hope someone here knows who he is, a fantastic man. He's a really genuinely wonderful guy. I could tell you more about him in the Q&A if you were curious. He taught me that the sustained work should be paramedical rather than problem-solving clinical. And I began gradually following this path to learn that I should work in areas where wretchedness is considered normal, and slowly began to discover that this was in the largest sector of the electorate in Africa and Asia. One can achieve little here because this is the field of development. This is the field of development. And Anne was kind enough to ask me to participate in her political lexicon project, where development was indeed the term that I offered. And I hope some of you will look at what's coming out in their volume, because this is why I wrote on development, because of this sense of what the field is. Development in Africa, so one can achieve little here, because this is the field of development, at best, as I said in that piece, and insertion into the circuit of capital without subject formation, at best. at worst a field of greed, bloodless violence. In the Indian context, because I'm a citizen and I know one of the 23 Indian languages very well as a first language, I can do the work at the schools, failing and attempting to learn collectively from my failure to access damaged mind machines. On the African side, I work at a rural state university in Nigeria to establish a consortial African multi-portal database of unsystematized first languages for quick oral learning, not research learning, etc. Has anybody in this room read a detective story called Poison Oracle by Peter Dickinson? Read it, because it is a genuine critique of anthropological golden aging of people's pasts and not accepting that there are very large sectors of the world where wretchedness is considered normal. It's a very interesting book. At any rate, so this will help the so-called developers to learn to work with the so-called quote developees, because they perhaps at best learn some of the lingua francas like Yoruba, perhaps a little bit of Zulu, perhaps a little bit of Kiswahili, and they go in thinking, oh, I'm really prepared. Whereas these are not the languages that the ones who are being developed are speaking. And this is a very long story, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But this is a field where, in fact, also the so-called capital is not being turned into social. So those are the two areas that we have to think about, how different it is from thinking about the working class taking Arbeitskraft as a homeopathic tool, and having learned that if you own the means of production, then you can. See, now that the citizen is the agent, Joe Stiglitz and I sometimes talk about the fact that perhaps this is only half a joke, that perhaps what we should talk about is the willingness to be taxed. This is to an extent a little bit like, how do you produce that kind of willingness? That's also, it doesn't sound like anything compared to, I'm really changing the world, I'm really giving back, I'm really doing this and that. It doesn't sound like much, but it's very hard, that's the thing. So this work is supported by, this R&D work, supported by a project at two great colonial African universities from West Africa and East Africa, where, by learning how to approach the rural-urban interface through storytelling is a bad word, but I'm a literary person, I can explain it. Storytelling and listening, we are trying to influence the R wing, the research wing of R&D, research and development. We are also questioning the divisive regionalism of Africa today. It's the failure of Pan-Africanism, which was written about by Fanon at the end of that The Wretched of the Earth, which people just read the first chapter, and even that, the way it was misunderstood by Sartre, a quick read. The rest of it is amazing in his absolute predictive capacity in describing states like, let's say, Mozambique and Angola today. The idea of what we have to call the neo-patrimonial state, where the so-called this is what's happening to India now. To keep the structures of democracy, supposedly, democracy which is dependent upon body count, arithmetical body count. That's what democracy is dependent on. So that, in fact, democracy can only flourish in a democratic society. It doesn't produce a democratic society. It is very dangerous because it's so hospitable to anything in the presence of an uneducated, not an uninformed, but an uneducated electorate that cannot judge. So, and that's where we are working in Africa and Asia. So to an extent, this idea that Eastern and West African universities are working together, that is already incredibly difficult. I wish I could take you through the steps, but this is the arena, not the usual arena of what did Marx really say, where these projects of changing capital from capitalist into socialist uses, this is the arena. It is interesting that the cutting-edge work by Rena Lederman, for example, in her meticulous research on human research ethics reviews, does not take research and development into account at all. It's a real disciplinary divide, where Rena is one of our PhDs, she teaches at Princeton, so one of these days we're going to sit down together and we're going to talk about this. My African colleagues, Dalali Badasu, Alo Denkabe, Wanjuri Gichui, and Helenita, involved in development work through civil society and the state. They're also faculty members of Ghana, Legon, and Nairobi, but they're involved in the research wing of development, are at work on this, and it's very difficult for them, trained as they are from within the discipline, to even take this seriously. At first, they just couldn't get their heads around this. But now, in fact, they are really working hard, as we are with them. What do I know? By interviewing differently, but also asking, and this is actually Dankabe's question, what is research? Which is, of course, the question here, research and development. What is it to research? So, this kind of work has made me come up. I said here, I do, of course, also try to join. Well, how am I doing? Another 5 minutes?
5.
5? Okay.
4.5.
4.5, okay. So, I do, of course, also try to join in training the global classroom, diasporic or otherwise, at an elite research one university in the world's financial center, Columbia University, in how to prepare oneself for, quote, helping. This kind of work has made me come up against absurd competition, vastly bigger, with immensely much more publicity, immensely much more money and capital at stake, with such easy targets in development. So I began to think about how all of this, including my own work, is about deciding the future. So let me cut down into just the one paragraph, and in fact I need Toni Morrison's book from there, it's still inside. I'll talk loudly, okay? So as we develop, as we struggle to decide other futures, thank you, we are in newer versions of abolition capitalism. And this is W.E.B. Du Bois. We are acting out what W.E.B. Du Bois, with extraordinary prescience, in the early years of the last century called, quote, abolition capitalism. Using the abolition of slavery as alibi, capital got rid of the inconvenience of chattel slavery and established itself globally by unifying, performizing North and South in the United States. The attempt at socializing the welfare state project of Reconstruction died in the hands of US racism. But, and this is important for us to remember, abolition capitalism still operates through the diversification of capitalism and our unacknowledged complicity as we point a finger and legitimize by reversal. It remains interesting that Thomas Piketty, in his powerful yet Eurocentric book, cannot acknowledge that Scandinavia, his example for ethical capitalism, lost it in the 90s, largely because of the influx of the visible minority refugees. I wrote upon it in some detail in 1992, and then again in 2013. So, as we develop, as we struggle to decide other futures, we are in newer versions of abolition capitalism. And I think of the connection between Marx's version of the caste system at the beginning of the chapter on the so-called primitive accumulation. So I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to say that this idea of something like the caste system rather than class, Du Bois also uses it when he is thinking about how the poor whites have been oppressed. And Toni Morrison, of course, Du Bois's gendering is dreadful. And in fact, I invite all of you not just to read Hazel Garby, who's too harsh perhaps, but I invite you to watch a wonderful film by Louis Massier, on Du Bois, where Du Bois's granddaughter, and it reminds me of those of you who know Nirod Chaudhary, he spoke of his choice of wife in this way too. Du Bois's granddaughter, Du Bois Williams, innocently says that when he was in Tennessee, he was invited because he was so good looking and, you know, so intelligent and everything. He was constantly invited by mothers of single daughters. And he started making a list of the good cooks and the good looking ones. And the one who actually was on both lists was the one he married. So she said it with all innocence about his grandfather. But Toni Morrison, on the other hand, just as she maternalizes the story of Abraham and Isaac, except history does not rest her hands at this end, in the same way, in her new God Help the Child, tells this story of someone understanding that the ideological use of race is what helps this kind of thing, the Booker who goes on to study economics, and then she also does, as in Beloved, you remember there too, the woman is it's the white girl, Denver, who actually gives to Sethi some kind of opening. In here too, it's the white girl who called Raisin, who says, I miss my black lady, my black lady. And that particular thing, which Du Bois has, not to just keep it confined to one group of voting bloc democracy, which is not democracy at all. I mean, he says that to establish and his word, just a Negro Union, was to go against the idea of what Marx was trying to do. Toni Morrison, in fact, is doing that as well. Remember except she genders it the other way. Page 10 of Beloved, she talks of the withholding of rape from Sethi by the ones in the plantation, in a way that really relates to some of the things that I could have read if this thing was not so badly time budgeted, about how it is that one approaches, let's say, child marriage and dowry in those kinds of contexts, trying to understand the mindset of those other people, the people who have been epistemically damaged by us, caste Hindus, but I can't go there. But at any rate, I did want to say this. I wanted to say that if you are going to look at abolition capitalism working today, you should read it, not just Du Bois, with Toni Morrison, to see how she moves almost along comparable lines. I'm quite sure she's not imitating him. She's thinking the same way, except, of course, it's wonderfully gendered. Now, so I'm at an end. Let me just say, well, you know, the conclusion for this is not going to match this audience. So what conclusion shall I offer? No conclusion at all. I will say that this work will be finished one of these days, and when you see it published in the Resnick and Wolf volume, you will say, we heard a really disorganized early version of it, and look how well she has revised it. Fantastically wonderful essay it now is. If you think that, say it in public. If you think it is rotten, say it to me. Thank you. Rohingyas, but I can't because time is up. Remember, Majid, I said that I told the Rohingya folks that they should talk about the Rohingyas under all circumstances when they're speaking in public, and I've been following my advice. I said, talked about the Rohingyas at Birkbeck, I talked about the Rohingyas at LSE, yes, and I talked about the Rohingyas to the New York Times guy who interviewed me on violence. I talked about the Rohingyas in the 2 talks in Munich, 2 talks in Paris, but the new school defeated me. Well, I've almost talked about them, right?
Okay, I imagine you want to take your questions.
Huh?
Excuse me. Would you like to take your own questions? Or would you like me to?
You organize. So there is one question, would you like to talk about the Rohingyas? But I think, and don't you think I should take 3 together?
I don't know, they get lost. But, let's try 2.
2.
I can ask.
Steve.
Okay. Oh, there was a mic.
We'll be fancy here.
I think usually do 3, but you're maybe right.
Okay, so my name is Millie, and I'm interviewing migrants who travel from India to the UK. And my question to you is about activism.
About what?
Activism.
Activism.
I don't have access to big institutions, and I would like to make a difference in the lives of the migrants that I'm researching. And I'm not sure if you felt that when you deal with vulnerable population, they expect you involved in their lives in order to change them. So I'm in a situation where I want to help and I want to reach out. I don't have the resources like you do, but I want to.
What resources do you think I have?
You have connections.
What connections
Like
in where I do activism?
Where places where there is capital, where you can actually make capital move in a certain way, and I don't. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or any inspirational things that I could think of in a creative way as a person who doesn't have the capacity to make capital flow.
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Please make your question short, since there's so many people who I know will
And are we
want
doing
that.
it one by one, or are we doing?
We're gonna do 2, and then we may move to 3 if Gayatri can keep them all in her head.
This one, I can take another one.
Yes.
The first one was very brief.
Yeah, you were mentioning this man who you said was really special, and you asked if someone asked the question that you would talk more about him. So could you talk more about that guy?
Oh, Zafrullah Chowdhury.
Yeah.
This is a very good technique of questioning. don't pick this up usually. People say, if you wanted to, and they forget it all. But okay, good. Shall I do this? Okay. So, let me talk about the activism part first. Millie, I think you have to find resources. The World Economic Forum and all that stuff, those things I am tokenized and invited. I never say no to tokenization because you're invited. They invited me not as a person of color. Their person of color is a white guy from South Africa. But they invited me as a Columbia prof, okay? And so that they could say that they have a radical professor also there. Most of these people don't go. They had invited, this is an ethical committee on various things. They had invited Anthony Appiah, he never went. Then they had invited Homi Bhabha, he also never went. Then they invited a woman called Rosenfeld, whom I don't know personally, but she seemed to be a very interesting person, a philosopher who won a prize from NYU. She resigned. But I stay because I learn from really getting into, I take them seriously, I don't insult them. I say to them what I feel, but that's not where the activism is, that's fieldwork. So that because they don't know, you see, I told, no, I didn't say it here. Last month, as a result of being on this committee, they're beginning to take me a little bit seriously. Let's see what happens, I don't know. Last month, I spoke one-on-one with the head of Trade Union Advisory Committee of the OECD for about an hour and a half. And with this planning group for about, 2 or 3 hours. And then also with the CEO of a very good donor country, European donor country, one-on-one for about an hour and a half. All 3 asked me what I thought was the main problem. And I said the main problem, as I perceived it, was, that's a reality check, the great gulf fixed between what they accessed as the grassroots and the real bottom feeders. That's what I said. Now, it is among those bottom feeders that I have my schools. I don't think of it as activism. They have no clue as to, quote, who I am, unquote, believe me. So there, it's not connections. In fact, it's hard to work there and be taken seriously. I teach there as I teach, and how did I do this? I didn't offer to do it. I was asked about 30 years ago by someone who saw that I was constantly teaching, I'm a boring person in that respect. I was correcting people's spellings, and I was doing arithmetic in the dust with twigs and so on. And so they wrote me a note saying, a handwritten note, Prashantara Kit, in fact, a middle-class activist who's now become a kind of fat cat himself, but he wrote me saying, Didi, why don't you open some schools here? And I didn't want to do it because, I don't know why, but that's how it began. So then finally I kind of quickly did it, put it in a mail, I called my ma, I said, Ma, I've done something really hard. That is, it's not like a marriage, I can't get out of it. I think this damn thing is going to really haunt me all my life. And so there were no connections there. I had earned the confidence of a local activist, so he invited me. And I'm always in trouble because of the fact that I am unconnected with anything. I don't take corporate funding, I'm not an NGO. It's my own salary, which is now beginning to meet its limit because the government of India has raised the salary of rural police and the lowest rung of the primary school teachers. So I will have to raise their salary by much if I want to keep them. And so there, you find your way. You see, you find your resources, connections, but I will give you one piece of advice, which may be incorrect in your case. Please forgive me, I don't know you. But it is not a good idea to go in thinking that you will give something to them and help them, etc. Because the first question that one asks is, who am I to help? Who am I to help? The first right of these people is to refuse. So that, I think, that would be my little piece of advice there. Don't think that way. Yes. And so that's number one. Number two, Zafrullah Chaudhary. Zafrullah Chaudhary was a person who, with a medical degree, he's 3 months older than I, Zafar, with a medical degree, he was actually in Britain doing quite well. At the time of the War of Independence of Bangladesh, he gave it up and he opened a field hospital where he worked untiringly to help. And then, after the war was over, he actually opened a fantastic People's Health Center where he brought in absolutely rural women, and this was like more than 30 years ago, okay, when I began all of this new narrativization. And the whole story of why I went to him, that would take too long, but that's quite interesting one of these days. But he was just, in fact, indicted by Bangladesh government because of this whole business of, of contempt of court because he had suggested. Well, I don't yet know quite what happened to Zafar. As I say, he's 3 months older than I. But he brought in women from the absolute rural area and trained them to be paramedics, trained them to drive cars in the Bangladesh of more than 30 years ago. And when I went there, for reasons that it would be too long a narrative, he totally blew me away because, an upper caste Hindu from West Bengal come to help because her father was born in Mymensingh, which is in today's Bangladesh. And for the first time, I want to go and talk to him, and he said, no, I don't have any time. He later told me, and we laughed and laughed and laughed together, that he was really putting me to the test. He put me in with those paramedics, and I had to live with them, eat with them, travel with them, go on one bamboo bridges over foaming waters on them, etc., to see if I was serious about these things. Many stories I could tell. And then he now, in fact, runs a medical school, he runs a medical school, and he's still, I'm 74 and he's older than I. He's still extremely much an activist within the Bangladesh context, always threatened, but always with a lot of supporters, including me. And one thing I'll say, the only time that I've spoken at a university in Dhaka, I said, in answer to a man who in fact taught here, I think, what was his name? Come on, Anwar Sheikh's student. What was his name? Come on, in economics. The guy who never finished his PhD, went off. What was his name? Well, I'm not, Salimullah Khan. Okay, Salimullah Khan asks me, because he's again a big deal in Bangladesh, he's sitting in the front row, he's talking to me about national liberation, etc. And I said to him, I'm sorry, national liberation is not a revolution. And then Zafrullah comes to me and hugs me and says, Gayatri, bravo, you had the courage as an Indian in Bangladesh to say this. I never thought you would be able to say how right you are. And so I have a very strong bond with him, but this is the guy, a really selfless activist. And talk about the Rohingyas, very brief, okay? The Rohingyas are ethnic Muslims who are the victim of a slow genocide on the part of Myanmar. And the Orientalist vision of Buddhism as a religion that has no violence at all is completely undone by both Burma, then Thailand, and Sri Lanka. And what, in fact, Aung San Suu Kyi has done is, because she's wanting to hold on to power, she is with the majority party, which actually does this kind of slow genocide. And these words have been uttered by Amartya Sen in public. He's a very, very careful man, as you know. I'm not just saying it by myself. And recently, when there was a fire, and somebody reported that it was the Rohingyas had suffered, she said she would be happy if the name Rohingyas was not used. So she's even denying them their name. And there have been editorials in Western newspapers which have said that Madame Suu Kyi is doing this because she wants to bring in democracy finally into Myanmar, and therefore she's holding in with the majority party. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. And you know, she was educated before she went to Oxford at Lady Shri Ram College in India, in Delhi, so I have a sense maybe of where she's at. But I want to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I want to tell her that if the majority party is genocidal, you're not going to bring in democracy. So that is what I was saying, and what I had said to them was that in order, and there too this wretchedness is normal, you see the smile on the faces of the young boys sometimes in these photographs, because they're being photographed. And so what, and you know, these are the real stateless people. Bangladesh refuses them, Thailand refuses them, Tamil Nadu refuses them, they're just going from here to there, here to there. I said to the Rohingya activists in Oxford that what they need to do is, rather than keep it an identitarian struggle only about the Rohingyas, every time they spoke in public, they ought to relate this to broad global issues. That's where activistically the global is at, not with Bruno Latour giving us a refitted global. You know, we can talk about what women do when they want to hold on to power, and how they essentialize themselves as women. You know, she said at Columbia, when I see someone in uniform, I think of my father. You know, that is not really something that a two-fisted man would say very easily. You know, like Hillary saying, when I was pregnant with Chelsea, you know what I mean? So this kind of thing we can talk about. We can relate it to all kinds of state-legitimized violence all over the world. We can relate it to violence on the part of ethnic Muslims when in this new Khilafat that I was talking about. So they could relate it to many things, because Myanmar has just opened its first stock exchange. Talk about capital being used for social. I mean, the woman that I was talking to, the CEO of the Good Donor Country, first degree in drama. And so, like a long, long talk, she is traveling to Burma with the Ericssons to digitalize all of the government structures. She hadn't heard of the Rohingyas. So what I said to the Rohingya activists was, to take it away, digital information no longer does any good. There's so much printout. You need to go back to the old way of one-on-one. Whenever you open your mouth politically, put it in with the general structures of global oppression all over the world, rather than stay in an identitarian way with just the Rohingyas. So I made it as brief as possible, but thank you for asking.
We're going to just take 3 more questions. We're going to put them together, but I want them to be questions that you really need to have answered tonight. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I need it.
I was wondering if you can explain how to understand the perception of capital as good, whereas as opposed to capitalism as bad, given that I don't think I can imagine divorcing capital from capitalism, or perhaps I'm wrong.
Another good question.
Good
Wonderful
question,
question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, my question is because I'm coming from an entirely different field.
Louder, please.
I'm coming from an entirely different field, which is international relations. And I'm quite
It's not
surprised.
entirely different.
Yeah, and it's quite surprising. I would say it's not different because we're talking about race and we're talking about capitalism. But exactly, an example with this would be the Millennium Conference this year, and they're talking about racialization as not really part of the mainstream discourse in international relations. And in international relations, when you talk about foreign policy, everything is so quick. Like, this happens today, tomorrow the state will have a response. And my question is, can we keep up these kinds of thinking when we reflect? Can we keep up with that kind of speed, the way states react, the way states leaders react, in order to influence their decision making?
Okay?
Thank you. And a final. Where? Yes, please. Red shirt.
So I'm from an urban design program, and a bunch of us were invited to market in Quito to work with a very marginalized market there, to work with a group of activists there to come up with strategies to defend that market, which was facing some kind of threat of displacement.
I'm not hearing you.
Oh.
Hearing where?
In Quito, in Ecuador.
Okay, in Quito.
Yeah,
Quito.
that's
Okay.
right. So I've been working with a Quechua school there, with the director of the school, to develop these after-school programs that work with the women, informally working women, mothers in the market, to develop these programs with their kids. But I've also been working with Immigrant Movement International, which is in New York, to work with the mothers, Ecuadorian immigrant, informally working mothers here. And I was really, I come from, I'm a Bengali from Calcutta who stays in Mumbai,
Yeah.
and I really wanted to go back there to make that network of programs somehow reach there. But I was just wondering, from your experience, would you advise me to go back there? Now there's an atmosphere of threat for like any kind of political education to happen there in the current situation there. So would you think it's important to work from India in this situation, or from here where I can have a few more liberties?
It's hard to say. You are a Bengali American, right? No. I would say that it is it really depends on. I mean, I don't. What I said to Millie, I don't know you. I would really have to be. One can't give this kind of advice in the abstract to someone, right? This kind of advice. I think that, I don't work with anyone. I really work for these people because it's a kind of repayment of ancestral debt. I'm the one, I belong to the group that harmed them, right? I say to them that I don't do anything particularly for women because down there, women and men, although there is a kind of constant education against gender envy, constant education against taking rape culture and bride culture as normal, etc. It's not, what I really teach there is how to teach the state curriculum so that they can enter the mainstream. I'm not into income production or in political education or anything. I don't belong to a party. And so it's really just teaching. It's really just teaching. But what I am completely devoted to is the quality of the education. If my standards there are the same as my standards in Colombia, I do not think that it is activism of some sort. I have two jobs, one here and one there. And I go 8 or 9 times a year, and I'm there for the maximum amount of time, that's good for the training, that they don't begin to obey me. I'm just telling you all this in terms of the kind of work I'm thinking about, not helping people, but teaching in this way, interested in quality and also interested in forming, and I'm not succeeding, I'm failing trying to learn from my failures. What I'm trying to do is to develop a kind of philosophy of pedagogy whereby you can actually insert these small children of the very poor into the intuitions of democracy, which is an aporia between ipseity, autonomy, me, my rights, and people completely unlike me who must also be perceived as equal. It's very difficult to say this to the terribly poor. I mean, so poor that the children play with rocks and stones. I mean, this is not like the urban subproletariat. And they go away at the age of 5 to look after. And this is normal. This wretchedness is normal. It's not like pictures you see in Save the Children, give $5 and you will give them the BMW and so on. No. The thing is that, therefore, this project is related to what I do. And so I don't really know whether it would be, it is unsafe in India, yes, but on the other hand, you're a young person, but I don't, see, you and I are different in this respect. I don't really have, I can't die young. So therefore, that's that. In terms of the work for doing it in New York because it's safer, I'm a little, I've written so much about this that and I have more questions here still to answer, but I can refer you to some of the stuff. I'm impatient with self-selected moral entrepreneurs, international civil society. And so I'm perhaps wrong, but that's just my way. And so I don't know. I think any work is good. Any work is good. I'm not against, I would be against violence. Again, I would be against shopping till you drop. I would be against those kinds of things, right? But I'm not a censor. But I myself don't feel very moved by the New York-based stuff that I see. But I may be completely wrong. Attention to quality is something, and also to know exactly what you're going to do. I don't really know. I'm really still trying to learn what these damaged, and I'm their enemy. I say to them, I'm your enemy. Remember that, because we are the ones who did this to them. And I say, I'm good, my parents are good. But 2 generations don't undo thousands of years of not giving you the right to intellectual labor, bringing you up for manual labor, punishing you. So, and anything you're getting now is because I'm here. You have to do without it. That's a very different kind of relationship. So, as for the other questions, the one, sorry? Yes, I will briefly if I can. The racialization, can we keep up? I don't know if we can keep up. That depends very much on skills you develop. But I do know that if one focuses only on racialization when one is doing, that's a problem. This scapegoating of racialization that leads to identity politics and an ignoring of class. And I don't think that's a good idea. That's what I was reading in Du Bois and Toni Morrison. And so, as to whether at that speed we can, I don't think we can do much of anything. I mean, if I had read the whole thing, then I would have talked about that one-on-one work, which is both one-on-one and collective. But that's something that I don't think it would take too long. As for the capital and capitalism, it's, well, you should learn to separate capital from capitalism. I mean, that is something that, it would really take a long time. I'm not faulting you. I used to go to the Graduate Institute in Dubrovnik, and it was a fantastic institute, and I was fortunate enough to make friends with Praxis International. It was a fantastic thing. But after the disappearance of Yugoslavia, after a few years in the same institute, they have feminist meetings, and I was asked. And I just said this, what I just said, and they have so lost touch with any kind of work with Marx that they also couldn't understand this. And I spent 2 hours, which I think would not be a good idea right now, I spent 2 hours explaining this. It's actually in their book, rather than present the paper that I had brought to present, because they really wanted to know. It's a good question. But unless one is able to do this, it's not possible to, but then one becomes a kind of romantic anti-capitalist, small is beautiful, everything use value, etc. This is hopeless in our world. Therefore, it's the uses of capital for social use and the uses of capital for greed. Those are 2 separate things. Capital is not bad. So, but I can't really explain that. Take it as a statement right now, and one of these days, maybe we'll have a longer talk where I'll try to explain this by pointing here and there. But thank you for the question. It's a very important question.
Gayatri, has been on for 10 hours now. Since 9:30 this morning.
No, I got up at 3. I'm jet lagged, I got up at 3.
I want to thank her, but I also want to tell all of you that tomorrow night, Jay Bernstein is one of our other masters, is going to be talking on socialism as constellation, Adorno's critique of Hegel. And on Wednesday night, Judith Butler, to preserve the life of the other, all at 5:30 in this room. So Gayatri, thank you.
Thank you.